I'm passing on the baton to Eyal Ronen. Dr. Eyal Ronen from Tel Aviv University is going to be the session chair for the next talks. Eyal, the floor is yours.
One second. Hi. Can you hear me? Okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, great. Okay. So I'm going to start the first session of today, and it is my honor to present Vanessa Teague from the Australian National University. Vanessa is a researcher in applied cryptography and privacy, and her works analyze the privacy and security offered by different protocols, implementations, and approaches. You heard her yesterday talking about de-identification of location data, which is, of course, closely related to what we're going to talk about today in the topic of contact tracing. Vanessa is a very well-known and appreciated public advocate for privacy, and I'm really looking forward to this talk. Vanessa?
Thanks, Eyal. I have a much less formal and less comprehensive slide deck than I did yesterday, because primarily I think this is a much less well-traveled area, and I expect there are probably a lot of people in the audience who already know a lot about it, and there are so many aspects of it that no individual can keep up. So I'm going to talk for less time and open more time for questions as we go. So the title of my talk, which matches the title of yesterday's talk, is Privacy Preserving Contact Tracing Probably Isn't. So let's just do a little summary of what we're talking about and what the kind of privacy implications might be for Bluetooth-based exposure notification apps. I just realized I forgot to share my screen. Let me try that again. Okay, can everybody see my slides now? I hope so.
Yes.
Okay, tell me if you can't. Oh yeah, yes, good. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about Bluetooth-based exposure notification apps. You're carrying around this little device that has the potential to both scan and advertise itself via Bluetooth. And just walking about scanning and advertising is bad for your privacy, regardless of what app you're actually running. So that's the first step. Then on top of that, making a record of the Bluetooth messages you've received is also bad for your privacy, because now you've got a log on your phone of who you've been near. And again, this is kind of regardless of whether it's a centralized or decentralized design. It's very, very unfortunate and annoying that if you're running an Android device, you have to turn Google location services on in order to use the exposure notification API. In other words, you have to give Google permission to track your location, even though they don't actually track your location as part of the exposure notification API, or so they say. They promised to fix that, but in practice, the fix isn't going to come soon for anybody. And as these apps have started rolling out across the world, we've seen a whole collection of different fielded designs, and we've seen bugs that affected both privacy and functionality, and we've seen them in both the centralized and decentralized designs. So I'm sure that there are a lot of people listening who have already studied this in considerable detail and probably already have considerable evidence-based opinion one way or the other. It's important to note that from the very beginning, some people, including Ross Anderson, have pointed out that maybe the correct answer is we should be doing neither of these things. We still don't really know for sure whether any of these apps contribute anything useful, although we might be at a point where we're starting to get that kind of information. So what I'm going to be saying in this talk is all of these things are true, right? It's all bad, but some of it is a lot worse than others. And in particular, as the citizen of a country that runs a centralized contact tracing, COVID tracing app, I feel very strongly that the centralized models are a lot worse for privacy than the decentralized ones. So I know that both Serge and Carmela are speaking after me, and I'm going to assume that they're mostly talking about the decentralized models. And I know that there are issues with them, but what I'm going to say in my first half hour or so is the issues with the centralized models at worst. So let's have a look at some of the details. So one of the things that is true for all things of this form, regardless of whether it's a centralized architecture or a decentralized architecture, is that even if you're not uploading your exact location or your absolute location via GPS or whatever, just the fact that you're walking around making Bluetooth communications all the time is a long established means of location tracking that goes back long before anybody sort of using this for disease control. So the idea, excuse me, the idea is that, yes, let's say a shopping centre or a train station or some other public place might be fitted out with little Bluetooth-enabled devices, and those Bluetooth-enabled devices are kind of constantly listening for what you're sending out via Bluetooth on your phone. So you're constantly sending out something that might look kind of random, but if it looks kind of random and you don't refresh it frequently enough, then this series of little beacons throughout the shopping mall or the train station can identify when the same person came back to the same place. And then, as we've seen for re-identification, if they can tell that the same person is visiting over and over again, then it doesn't take them very much to figure out which person it is. Excuse me. So all of the designs in this space put some effort into changing the random message that they're sending out over Bluetooth. They try to change it fairly frequently and unpredictably, but it turns out that this is just a world of pain, and that doing a good job of good pseudonymous Bluetooth pinging is an awful lot harder than I thought. So like many of you, I've been thinking about this for months and months and months, and it began by thinking about the beautiful theoretical properties of the different kinds of cryptographic designs. I followed the DP3T project from very early on back in like March, and I participated in a lot of discussions with the MIT Pacta group about whether we should have a centralized or decentralized design. So we thought hard about the crypto, but now that it's started to come out in the world, we've realized that a lot of these horrible practical implementation details actually have a impact on privacy that is comparable to the implications of the choice of cryptographic protocol. So here's my talk outline. I'm first going to just go back to what Orr said by way of introduction and just explain a little bit more and provide some pictures about the different design options that are available and a little bit about what's been chosen in each country. Then I'm going to talk about the two apps that I've spent time looking at in detail. Firstly, the United Kingdom's Centralised app for their national health system, and secondly, Australia's COVIDSafe app. So I think Orr said this already, but I'll say it again. So the difference, there are really two main design architectures that are common in the world. Either way, every app is constantly sending little Bluetooth messages to everybody else's app in range, and it's constantly recording all of the random looking Bluetooth pings that it hears. But the information flow can be completely different in two different ways. So in a centralized design, the random looking message that you're constantly sending out over Bluetooth is actually an encryption of your ID. And so you're constantly gathering encryptions of other people's IDs, which you cannot read. And if you test positive for COVID-19, you send to your central authority the complete list of encrypted IDs that you've received from other people. And then that central authority presumably has the capacity to decrypt them, figure out who they are, and then notify those people that they might have been exposed. In a decentralized design, it starts off the same way with everybody sending random looking Bluetooth messages to everybody else, but the underlying information flow is completely different. So you're still sending out random looking messages. You're still recording all the random looking messages that you've received. But if you test positive, your app uploads the seeds that you used to generate all of the pings that you sent. So this gets uploaded to a server that's effectively public, and then everybody in your country or everybody in your state downloads the list of seeds from infected people, and then on their own device, they regenerate the Bluetooth pings that those seeds would have produced, and they check for themselves whether they might have been exposed to a person who's just tested positive. So this is a completely different information flow in which the information about whether you might have been exposed to the infection is computed on your own device in a way that the central authority does not need to know, and in some designs does not ever know, and thus these designs, the cryptographic protocol design, is much more privacy preserving from a centralized authority. Doesn't necessarily mean it's more privacy preserving for the other Bluetooth based tracking issues that we talked about before, but in terms of what your government learns about who's been near whom when, the decentralized design is inherently more privacy preserving because the centralized design would be uploading that information immediately. So when people talk about the Google, Apple exposure notification API as being privacy preserving, they're primarily talking about the fact that it preserves from the central authority the edges of the social graph. In other words, the information about who has been near whom, when, and for how long. It doesn't necessarily protect the privacy of who has been infected with the disease, and it doesn't necessarily, although it probably does a better job in practice, prevent Bluetooth-based tracking by people who've got Bluetooth beacons near where you're walking. So here's a nice picture from the United Kingdom National Health Service from the National Cybersecurity Centre, that basically just says in a picture exactly what I just said a minute ago. So you can see steps 1 and 2 are more or less so step 1 is more or less the same, and step 2 shows you the different kinds of information that the person is uploading. And then you can see in the decentralized design at step 3, the users' phones are just downloading stuff from this public notice board. And then in step 4, they're checking themselves. Whereas you can see on the right-hand side in the centralized design, there's a central database that is decrypting all the information, reading who has been exposed to a infected person, and deciding who's had a high-risk interaction and who deserves to get a push notification. All right. So some countries went for decentralized designs first. And in particular, a lot of countries are now using, and used from the beginning, the exposure notification API from Google and Apple, which runs a decentralized design. Switzerland, Austria, Italy, Ireland, a bunch of others. Some started with a centralized model, or started with the intention of running a centralized model, and then changed their minds and switched to the Google Apple exposure notification API. And of them, I know about Germany and the UK. Some just started with the centralized model and stuck with it. France, I believe, although correct me if I'm wrong, and certainly Australia. So part of the reason that this whole field is, this whole area is very contested, is that even within those two different categories, not all apps are equal. There are details that really matter even within each group. So for example, when we're talking about a centralized app, it might get a more or less amount of data. The central database might actually be storing more or less information about each person and their contacts, and it might do a better or worse job of protecting the data. Decentralized apps are allowed to invite users to upload more information than necessary, Google and Apple has a rule preventing them from forcing users to upload more information than necessary, but they can ask users to opt into uploading extra information, and that obviously has significant privacy implications. So there are a lot of different options, and they affect privacy against third parties, privacy from the central authority, and functionality and whether or not it just works or doesn't work. So administrators get a chance to look at other countries, look at their own country, figure out what works or doesn't work, and make changes. And they can take advantage of those opportunities to learn or not, if they prefer. So I'm going to run through two illustrative examples in this talk, one from the United Kingdom and one from Australia. And as I've said already, the story in the UK is they tried a centralised design, it didn't really work, and they've switched to the Google Apple Decentralised Exposure Notification API. Australia tried the same thing, it didn't really work, but they stuck with it anyway. So back in the day when we were first thinking about whether a cryptographic protocol that was centralized or decentralized was better or worse than the other, there were a lot of details that we hadn't even thought of. And when we started looking at the actual systems that were fielded, the Singaporean and Australian designs in particular, and I believe one of the designs that is very common in Europe, had this completely bizarre design aspect that had never occurred to me or anyone in any of the discussions that I'd been involved in. So it's a centralized design. You want to encrypt your own, you want to be sending out an encrypted version of your own ID. And we had all just assumed that you would be using public key cryptography to encrypt your ID on your own device and sending it out around the world. Now it turns out, for some reason, this was not the way that it was done. In the Singaporean app, which was mostly adopted by Australia, you didn't generate your own encryption of your own ID. You downloaded from a central government server some random looking stuff which you had to trust was an appropriate, correct encryption of your ID, and then you had to send that around with you. So even if the app was open source, which the Australian and Singaporean ones were, you actually had no way at all of figuring out whether these messages that you were sending were accurate representations of your ID or were properly encrypted to protect the privacy of your ID from everybody who was recording it as you went past or anything. So I wrote a little blog post saying, you know, that really wasn't such a great idea, and probably we should be encrypting our own IDs on our computers, on our own devices that at least we had a bit of control over. Not everybody was quite so polite about that particular architecture. I'm often accused of being impolite in Australia, but I'm really a lot less impolite than many. And I agree with Nadim, right? I agree with the sentiment expressed in this tweet. This is a completely insane design, because now it's one thing to be sending out Bluetooth messages that you made, and it's a completely different thing to be sending out Bluetooth messages that you downloaded from something you hope was the server you were supposed to. So I think this little thing illustrates that those high-level discussions we had back in March and April about what the ideal cryptographic protocol would be are quite different from the on-the-ground design decisions that we have to argue about now. Okay, so back to the high-level questions about whether we should have a centralized or decentralized design. There really are arguments both ways, right? And I have a lot of respect for many of the people who have argued in favor of the centralized design, although I think on balance, the decentralized design is better. The key aspect of the centralized design is that the central authority can build potentially a huge database of of the social interactions, the face-to-face social interactions of everybody who was infected with the disease. And they can build that database. They can record an approximation to how close together you were, how many people were with you at the time, how long you were with other people, and so forth. And they have the potential to follow that up and link that with information about who subsequently tested positive for the infection, whether different strains were passed around in different ways, and so forth. So you could really see that if you didn't care at all about privacy, but you were the kind of public health practitioner who loved looking at larger data sets and trying to figure out stuff, you would see the centralized model as a huge feature, right? You would see the building of this database as a huge feature. On the other hand, I certainly see the building of this database as a huge risk, because the risk that the database gets abused for political purposes, like finding out which journalist visited which was close to which potential source, or which students are hanging out with which political activists, or you can think of numerous possible opportunities for abuse, even if the database doesn't subsequently get leaked, which obviously is the obvious risk. So Australia and the UK, as I said, both at first adopted centralised designs. And you can imagine what I thought of that, because I was envisaging the joy of watching that giant centralised database getting weekly de-identified and posted on the internet. But actually Australia did the right thing and legislated that they weren't going to use the data for anything other than using it directly for contact tracing. The UK took a different approach and wrote a long and detailed white paper explaining the epidemiological value of building and using that database and how useful the data analytics were going to be. So it's interesting that even among the centralized model, they took these two different approaches to what they were going to do with the data. They also took completely different approaches to transparency around the data. So the UK put out in advance a great deal of detailed information about their cryptographic protocol design, about what they were going to do with the data, and really quite long and detailed. They put out the code for the app very early in the process, and they explained to us in great detail what they were doing and why they were doing it. They also ran a restricted trial on the Isle of Wight rather than rolling it out among the whole population. And in fact, I think that's all they ever did for their centralised design. So the process in the UK, I think, was really good, right? They did a good job of explaining what they were doing and doing it slowly and fairly carefully. I don't entirely agree with all of their design decisions. For example, although they did institute a design where the device generates its own Bluetooth pings, which I think is a really good thing, much better than the alternatives, they decided to keep that ping constant for 24 hours. So you were not changing the random value that you sent around any more frequently than once a day. So if you, for example, walked past a Bluetooth beacon in the tube or at a supermarket, and it observed what random looking Bluetooth ping you were making, and then you came back again to the same place in the afternoon, you would still be advertising that same value. So whoever was interacting with you via Bluetooth would know exactly that the same person had come back to the same place. So 24 hours is much too long. But, you know, the process that they went through was pretty good. So Chris Colnane and I took a careful look at the information that they put out, and we found some issues and wrote them up. And hopefully, if I can do the right thing with my slides. Okay, can everybody see my web browser instead of my slides now?
Yes.
Yes, good. Okay. So this is just an example, although this is probably the most important example. This comes back to this idea of tracking people when... Okay, so just as an example of the pain of Bluetooth-based tracking, I'm not sure how much went through before I got cut off, but I'll start again. So the system was sending out not only the random looking Bluetooth pings that you would expect, but also a little counter value called the keep alive characteristic. And the idea of this was to make sure that other devices nearby would keep making records instead of just taking one the first time the devices got near each other. They would keep every few seconds, they would keep making a new record with a new signal intensity, so that if the person stayed nearby for a while or moved around through different distances, the other device would have a kind of constant log of where they'd been and how far away they had been. So the British app designers had just implemented a very simple little 8-bit counter that gradually incremented through time. The problem is, if you think about the number of different possible values of this counter, you can compute exactly how long it takes through its regular increments until it overflows and restarts back at 0 again. And if you know that particular value for a specific person, that value, like the increment time, turns out to be 34 minutes, turns out to be a reliable and constant fact about that person's app, which you can use to recognize that person the next time they come by, even if it's over several multiple days. Now, there are some assumptions here. It only works if they have been in constant contact with other phones. But for example, if it's over a working week, let's say, where they're more or less constantly in contact with other people, you could potentially use that overflow time mod 34 minutes to track a person throughout the week. So anyway, Chris Cullinane figured that out, and we told the National Health Service, and we found a bunch of other kind of fairly standard sort of things about their crypto as well, because it was mostly just because it was the beta version. And they responded like civilized and decent and reasonable human beings, and wrote a nice blog post about how helpful it was for security researchers to help them fix their thing. So that was a good experience for all concerned. And I think it shows that the British process was basically a good process. It was a very transparent process. It openly solicited feedback. They did the right thing. Now, I think it's not a coincidence that this good process, which was quite open both about the reasons for certain design decisions and also about the shortcomings and problems that they had experienced, led to a transition to a decentralized design. So there are probably more British people on the call who know more about it than me, but this is just the thing I pulled out of The Guardian when I went looking for an explanation of why they'd transitioned. And it sounds like it was a combination of all of the things we've seen in Australia, but a combination of concerns about privacy and the gathering of that centralized database of contacts, and concerns about it just not working very well. You know, it just wasn't very reliable, and it interfered with people's other Bluetooth devices. And anyway, it was abandoned, and I believe they are actively working on and soon to field a new app based on the Google Apple API. So overall, the UK story seems to me to be a good story, right? There's nothing wrong with trying something in the belief that it's the right decision. There's nothing wrong with governments making decisions that turn out in hindsight to have been the wrong decision, because they did it in a very transparent way. They did it actually quite a democratic way, and they actively created and supported a democratic kind of a process in which people could look at what the app was doing, think about the reasons it was doing it that way, decide whether it was what they wanted, and decide to do something different. So, on a less optimistic note, now we're going to talk about Australia. So, you remember me saying the UK's centralised app had a design in which you generated your own encrypted IDs to send around via Bluetooth. Singapore's Trace Together and some of the European designs did the crazy thing that where you downloaded an encrypted ID from somewhere else. Australia's app does both. First, you download a random looking string from some Amazon server, then you encrypt it yourself. At least it changes more frequently than the British one. The Australian one now changes every 7.5 minutes, although in the early few months of use, it changed only every 2 hours, and it had a bunch of bugs that stopped it changing at all. So just as a little comparison, and I think I said this before, but in order to make the contrast, the UK put out a white paper describing their crypto protocol at the very beginning of their process. They published the source code for the app again right at the beginning, although they never published the source code for the server, which is unfortunate. They ran a trial on a small island for a good few weeks to assess and evaluate how well it was going. Australia shipped the app in April with a massive marketing campaign to get everybody in the nation to download it. They opened the app code in May. They've still never opened the server code. And they finally published the crypto protocol yesterday, a good few months after a bunch of us figured out what it was based on looking at the decompiled app from our Android devices. So this is a little bit ready, fire, aim, right? If there was something wrong with the crypto protocol design, it would have been nice to know in April. So a lot of our findings, I was expecting to look at it and look at the crypto and think about the security and privacy implications, but a lot of the things we found turned out to be just not working or for one reason or another. So it comes up with this cute little marketing message saying, COVIDSafe is scanning to keep you safe, smiley, which is like entirely deceitful, frankly, because even if it's working perfectly on my phone, it's not keeping me safe, right? The best thing that it could possibly be doing is keeping other people safe from me if I get a successful notification that I've been exposed and I obediently quarantine. There's no way it's keeping me safe because by the time I've been notified, I've probably already been exposed. But anyway, it was kind of marketed as this protective measure. In the early few weeks, it seemed to work okay on Android and not to work very well at all on iPhones, especially in the background or especially when the screen was locked. Over the last few months, they've introduced a bunch of bug fixes, and yet every bug fix seems to introduce at least an average of at least half a new bug. I'm not quite sure what the reproduction rate is, but one of my colleagues has remarked that they should stop calling it bug fixing and start calling it bug changing instead. Some of the new bugs they introduced took the iPhone version from sometimes working to not at all working. And there was, as I've seen a little bit of the discourse in France, there's been a lot of discourse in Australia from the politicians blaming Apple for the fact that their app doesn't work. And I can say absolutely definitively that the reason the Australian app did not work on iPhones was that the app had a bunch of bugs. Now it may, now that the bugs have been mostly corrected, still not work very well on iPhones, especially when backgrounded, but at least in the early few months, these were just kind of stupid software bugs of one kind or another. Just to give you a rough idea of the extent and frequency and severity of the problems we found, here's my I kept a little list on GitHub with Jim Massarat and a few other people of the list of issues that we knew about are in either the iPhone version or the Android version of Australia's app. So most of these were not found by me. Most of these were found by various other members of the open source community, including Jim Massarid, who's the co-author, and a bunch of other people. But we just wrote a list of the things we knew about. So some of the issues were about Bluetooth-based tracing, as we've discussed, Bluetooth-based tracking of a person. Some of the issues were, for some reason, the app made the phone's name accessible, which is probably fine if your phone is called Samsung Galaxy XYZ, but some people rename their phones, including with their own names. There was a really serious issue related to silently triggering a Bluetooth pairing process with the phone without actually explicitly making a notification to the person. And although it's now been fixed, it was pretty bad at the time, because once the attacker had paired with the phone, they could persuade the phone that they were a Bluetooth keyboard, and thus enter whatever commands they liked to the phone. There were a variety of different issues that allowed for permanent and long-term tracking of both Android and iOS devices. And again, it was all about the very fine details of what happens when you interact over Bluetooth. And when you think you're sending one simple message, you're actually exposing a fair bit more information, some of which doesn't change as fast as you think. And there were a bunch of ways that you could crash the app. There were a bunch of problems with the iPhone version only working in the foreground. There was a bug associated with the download of the encrypted IDs, in which they introduced this clever new idea that you should do your own encryption of the IDs that you downloaded from the central server, but they forgot to they got the settings wrong on the iPhone app for the iPhone keychain. And if your app was in the background mode on your iPhone, even if you were in the situation where you could potentially interact, you couldn't decrypt your keychain and get the token that you needed to download a new encrypted ID from the server, so you couldn't actually keep working. And the reason this particular bug is disappointing is that this wasn't an occasional, ephemeral, random kind of fault. If they had tested it on any iPhone for the 2 hours necessary to need to download a new ID, they ought to have been able to detect that it did not ever work. And so what we see here is a pattern that emerged really quite consistently, that they shipped things that they clearly hadn't tested, right? All they had to do was test whether one download worked when the phone was in background mode, and it would be immediately evident that it never worked. And yet they shipped it anyway and left it to a bunch of Apple developers in the open source community and, people who were just looking at it for fun to point out to them that this was broken. The same community of people figured out why there were so many complaints on the App Store about it interfering with other Bluetooth devices. It turns out that if you do Bluetooth connections over iPhone and you don't refresh the stack, you can only make a maximum of up to about 100 exchanges, and it wasn't forgetting any of the phones that it had met. So you could meet 100 other Bluetooth enabled devices, and then after you'd done that, all your slots were full and it just didn't talk to anybody anymore, which was unfortunate if one of the things you wanted to talk to was a diabetes monitor or your headphones or some other important part of your life. They broke the crypto so that iPhones, at one period for a special few weeks, there was no possibility for iPhones to exchange messages with each other, at least in one direction at all. because the payload was too long, and instead of understanding that they needed to split the payload into 3 different Bluetooth messages and send 1, 2, 3 separately, they split the payload into 3 different Bluetooth messages and sent the first segment and then the first segment again and then the first segment again, resulting in a ciphertext that didn't properly decrypt at the other end. And again, you would think that you would notice if you tested it, but they shipped it evidently without having tested it at all. So anyway, you get the idea, right? They invented a little bit of their own encryption with some more plain text counters that leaked more information, a lot like the British app, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25. This list is slightly out of date. Many of the issues have been fixed, but many of the later issues haven't been fixed, and we haven't quite updated it for some of the later issues that they introduced in the last couple of weeks. So you get the idea. And if we look on the Play Store, we get this kind of very mixed response. A lot of people want to like it. A lot of people responded to the marketing, the big exciting government marketing push, telling them how much they ought to like it and how important it was. And a lot of people expressed the idea that they really wish they liked it and they really wish they wanted to have it, but it doesn't actually work very well. So this person says, I hope it's just me. Sometimes randomly I have to briefly turn Bluetooth off in order to get my Wi-Fi to work again. Then I forget to reactivate Bluetooth, and anyway, I can't talk to them, and there's nowhere on the website to put technical feedback. And then a person down the bottom has written, in theory, this is a great idea. In practice, it's horrendous, privacy invasive. It breaks my Bluetooth. It crashes constantly. It doesn't automatically start at boot most of the time. It drains my battery life, etc. Okay, so a lot of the issues that are really affecting it actually have nothing to do with the privacy of people's contacts from a central government, which was the thing that bothered me. They don't even have anything to do with Bluetooth-based tracking, which was the thing that bothered me after I started learning about it. They're really just about it not working, right? It just kind of doesn't work. It interferes with my other devices. It drains my battery. It's a pain. So now I want to talk a little bit about how the Australian government managed the marketing and disclosure around this. I already said the UK did a pretty good job of explaining what they were doing and why, although they were much more overt about their intention to use the data. The Australian government made it clear that they did not intend to use the data, although, of course, we're still trusting them to keep their database secure. And they were very, very ambiguous about exactly how the data was stored and who had access to the data. So it turns out that this database that all of this contact information, if you test positive, is being uploaded to an Amazon web server. And because it does use public key encryption, it's a little bit unclear whether the data, the plain text, is readable by the Amazon web server, right? So when I look at the app code, I see public key encryption used for the things I send out, and hence I know that when my ID gets uploaded to the Amazon server because someone I was near tests positive, it's not immediately evident who holds the decryption key for that thing. And for a long time, the Australian government told people that the information was only available to state contact tracing teams. But it turns out, finally, now that we've got the crypto specification yesterday, it turns out that actually when they said it's only available to, they really didn't have any kind of cryptographic protection in mind. And in fact, the decryption key corresponding to the public key that we're all using is sitting on the Amazon server all the time. So anybody who breaks into the Amazon server, any foreign company that might happen to assert rights to access the data on the Amazon server, or indeed the federal government, if it happens to feel like it, has the information available to, the Amazon server has the information available to decrypt the data and figure out the edges of the social contact graph. So this slide identifies another important point of ambiguity in what was communicated about this app. So different countries have slightly different rules of thumb about what they call a close contact. Australia said 1.5 metres for 15 minutes. And a lot of people thought that the app was only going to record contacts of within 1.5 metres for 15 minutes. And the reason a lot of people thought that is because that's what it said on the FAQ of the official COVIDSafe app site. It said a COVIDSafe close contact is something that's been 1.5 metres within 1.5 metres for 15 minutes or more. And then it said, well, the app only notes that a close contact occurred to allow state or territory health officials to contact those users, etc. So we thought, well, this is interesting because it's actually really hard to figure out how far away somebody is. How does the app do that filtering? And anyway, if people are changing their pings every 7.5 minutes, how does it tell whether it's seen the same person over 15 minutes or more? And of course, the answer is this is simply not true, right? It's just logging everything, every Bluetooth message that it hears from another COVIDSafe app and logging it all and uploading it all. So the Amazon web server hears every ping that you received. There's no filtering for 1.5 meters in 15 minutes until it gets into the centralized database, at which point the privacy issue is moot. Okay, so do we know whether it's working yet? And the answer is we really have no idea. And indeed, since the authorities have been claiming consistently that it's working, even though we can conclusively demonstrate that it's not working, we're now in this weird state where we can no longer identify specific bugs that break it at the app end. But of course, there's a whole lot more unseen territory on the server side and in the communication to the contact tracers, and we really have no idea what's going on in the rest of the system. So we really have no idea whether it's working or not. It almost feels like the end of the children's fairy tale where somebody's about to get eaten by the wolf, right? Because nobody, even though they're still claiming the same thing, nobody believes them anymore. So even if it was now working, they've burned so much goodwill telling people that it was working when it was clearly not working that most people don't believe that it's working. And there's very little data. They've sat so hard on real empirical evidence about whether or not it's working that it's basically impossible to tell. So just to give you an example of the level of discourse in my country at the moment, this is today's ABC. An opposition senator in Parliament said, you know what would help contact tracing in Victoria? If we had an app that worked. The COVIDSafe app was supposed to be our ticket to freedom, our way out. It hasn't yet found one unique contact that wasn't found by manual tracking and tracing. The New South Wales Opal card has done a better job at tracking coronavirus than this COVID app. Now, I don't actually know whether either of those things are true either, but you get the idea of where the discourse has gone. And you can see exactly why the Opal card could be really useful, because the Opal card is exactly like, it's the Sydney equivalent of the Mikey card that I was talking about yesterday. It's the card that everybody uses to tap on and tap off to public transport. So if somebody's used that card to tap on a crowded bus and subsequently tested positive, you can see how easy it would be to use that card to track everybody else who tapped on at the same crowded bus. So I just want to end with a little summary and a couple of questions. So first of all of this stuff is bad for privacy, right? Turning on your Bluetooth if you didn't turn on your Bluetooth before is bad for privacy. Communicating over Bluetooth if you weren't doing that already is bad for privacy. Turning on Google location services if you didn't have it turned on already is definitely bad for privacy. But I really think the centralized architecture is a lot worse than the decentralized ones. And the thing that really frightens me when I look at the level of competence of the app code in my country is that those same people are responsible for securing the database that has all this incredibly sensitive information in it. And what we see is they just don't even do basic testing on the basic functionality of their things. So the idea that they're doing a good job of protecting this highly sensitive information seems highly questionable. we still don't really know whether any of these apps are doing anything useful. Maybe Carmela has something better to say about some recent results from Switzerland, but at least I, at the moment, don't know of any sound evidence either way for any of the apps that are out there already. So here's a little question that I'd like everybody to think about if you're not already thinking about other questions. I feel like we've kind of done the protocol design, and we've even kind of done a little bit of the privacy analysis. But what I haven't seen yet, but would really like to see, is how could we do rigorous empirical testing of whether or not it's working and doing anything useful for us? Because it might be worth making these privacy sacrifices if it's doing us good, but it's probably not worth making these privacy sacrifices if it isn't. So in the centralized model, the trusted centralized authority, if you live in a country lucky enough to have one, might possibly have that information. In a decentralized model, what are the best ways that we could go about getting it? Okay, so I'm going to leave it there and open to questions. My final slide is just a list of all the Australians and Brits who have investigated their own contact tracing apps.
Okay. Thank you, Vanessa. And if you have any questions, people in the audience, there's a Q&A channel that you can just put your question in, and I will read it out loud. No, Vanessa. And Vanessa, we have one first question from Jakob Stein, and he asks if you've looked into the ramification for the 5G sushi, or subscriber concealed identifier, which is supposed to solve some of the issues in the IMSI catching problem.
Oh, this is a really good question, but I don't know. I'm sorry. I haven't looked yet.
Okay, so I'm not sure it's my role, but I have looked into this, and
yes, please.
It does seem that the 5G solution solves at least some of the issues. It makes passive mass surveillance much harder, but there are some remaining issues in the current standard that if you have an active adversary that actually wants to target specific people, you can still use this type of devices, although active ones, to track individuals. So it's better, but not perfect.
Right.
Okay, yeah. And I have a question for you. It seems that a lot of the issues raised by people in the App Store, etc., is they have problem with their Wi-Fi or the Bluetooth is not working. And I want to know, to ask you, how did you try to, and how do you think that we should try to work with the general public to try to raise awareness to the privacy issues and make enough people care, not only that if the app is working or not, but does it protect their privacy?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, unfortunately, there was just so much obfuscation certainly from my government, I can't speak for the other governments of the world, that it was almost impossible. So this issue, for example, of whether it only records contacts that have been within 1.5 meters for 15 minutes, they specifically said that that was all it did. We could look at the code. It was obvious that it was logging everything. And yet if you ask a typical Australian, almost everybody believes that it only logs people who have been close for more than 15 minutes. And I don't know how you do that. How do you compete with somebody who's spending your tax money on a carefully engineered marketing campaign? And they spent a lot of money on, it's not clear exactly how much they spent marketing COVIDSafe, but they certainly spent a lot of money advertising and telling people to download it. I just do not know how a small band of impecunious troublemakers makes it known that these kinds of things are not true. I mean, on the bright side, maybe we don't need to, right? Because if it doesn't work and if it interferes with people's other Bluetooth devices, they're going to stop using it. I think in some ways a big theme of what I wanted to say to compare Australia and the UK is really that Australia and the UK started off at almost exactly the same position. But because the UK was actually really transparent about it, and really the government authorities actively supported a democratic discussion about it, they, I think, ended up making a much better decision by changing their mind over the ensuing months. Because the Australian government really quite actively misinformed the public about it, and did not until yesterday publish a cryptographic specification, did not tell the truth about how well it was working. In fact, again, quite actively misinterpreted how badly it was not working early in the process. We didn't really have the opportunity to have the kind of broad, fact-based democratic discussion that they did have in the UK. So unfortunately, I don't really know the answer to your question. It's actually really hard to ground proper public debate in a fact-based discussion when you have the leaders of your country spending money telling people that they should download it because it's like sunscreen, when in fact they know perfectly well it's not working.
Okay. And so I think I have a follow-up question on this. If we give an example in Israel, probably we'll talk about it a bit later, both in the talks and the panel. We have a specific solution that I think almost all of the public understands it's not privacy preserving. We have a mass surveillance by an intelligence agency that basically tracks all of the population. And there is still this large part of the population that says, okay, we're willing to sacrifice our privacy because we believe it might help us fight the COVID-19 situation. Yeah. No, do you think that even if there were, the facts were completely known in Australia, how do you think that people would take the trade-off between privacy and at least perceive the utility?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, I think they'd probably put up with whatever nonsense was pushed at them, sadly. I wish they didn't, but I think they would. And I don't really know how I wish I knew how you educated people against that. A lot of people feel relaxed and comfortable, and they don't feel that they have anything to hide, and they don't think they need to care. And I don't think, and I see this about elections as well, by the way. I talk about vote privacy and 90% of Australians say they don't care. But there has to be some way of conveying to the relaxed and comfortable 75 to 90% that actually there are maybe a small number or maybe a larger number of people who do care and who need to care. And for them, the system has to be built to protect their privacy. So, for example, we've had some pretty shocking news stories in Australia in recent times. We've had a police officer who deliberately passed on to the abusive ex-partner of a woman who was who had a restraining order taken out against him, her new address. We've had raids by the Australian Federal Police against journalists trying to figure out what their source was for a story that they published that was an embarrassing story about Australian soldiers allegedly committing war crimes. I think the only thing we have ongoing concerns, at least I have ongoing concerns about the safety and privacy of foreign students in Australia, particularly students who come from authoritarian regimes. There are increasingly credible reports that some of those authoritarian regimes try to interfere with what the students are saying and who they're associating with when they're here. So I guess what I would try to say to the relaxed and comfortable majority is to focus their attention on the possibility that there are people who are not as relaxed and comfortable as them, and that we need, even if they don't care about protecting their location privacy and they're willing to make sacrifices, it's actually a societal decision that affects people who do have a really good reason to care.
Okay. Thank you. And there is one final question. I hope I not mispronounce it. Gennaro Avitabel. I'm sure I mispronounce it. And I'll abbreviate. Basically, the question is, do you think that maybe a lot of the issues that were seen, the bugs in the application, could have been solved if Google Apple would have provided a more flexible API that wouldn't need this type of maneuvering around it to use the Bluetooth?
Well, so the Australian government's app does not use the Google Apple API at all. So it completely ignores the Google Apple API and just uses whatever the existing Bluetooth APIs are. And so that's what they've been saying. They've been saying, why did Google and Apple make this very specific protocol available that restricts our opportunity to gather the social graph? Why didn't they just kind of liberalize Bluetooth, make a much more general API that lets us do whatever we want? So what do I think about that? I think the implications for privacy would be a disaster, right? Because I think that it would be incredibly difficult I think it's bad enough as it is, but I think if they made a much more general thing available to a much greater set of apps, I don't think there's any, I think the implications of any app you like being able to retain this kind of information about who you've been near are pretty horrifying. And I don't even know how technically feasible it is, I should say. The Google Apple API does a very specific thing quite efficiently, whereas the COVIDSafe exchanging thing is quite inefficient and strange. And I don't actually know whether there's an easy way to make it work. I'm sure that Google and Apple could have, if they'd chosen, made an API that supported a more centralized model, but I personally am glad that they didn't.
Okay, so thank you again. And by the way, if you want to hear more discussion about the Google Apple API and what it could have not done, I think that will be a very interesting discussion in the panel later on today, which will talk about it. And so let's thank Vanessa again.
Thanks, everyone. And more questions are welcome. You've got my email, so anybody who wants to discuss further is always welcome.
Okay, so thank you.